What if I told you there's a town in Germany where music is banned? Because it once made 130 children vanish, no joke, no exaggeration. This isn't a horror movie, it's a real place, a real law, and possibly a real crime that's been disguised as a fairy tale for over 700 years. Welcome to Hamelin, a peaceful town tucked into the green valleys of Lower Saxony with timbered houses and cobbled streets that look straight out of a postcard. But beneath that quaint surface lies one of the darkest unsolved mysteries in European folklore. And no, it's not about rats. Not really. It's about something far worse. Something that still haunts the town to this day. You've heard of the Pied Piper, right? That creepy little story parents whisper to misbehaving kids, "Pay your debts or the piper will come for you." A man in bright patchwork clothes plays his flute and leads rats or children away, never to be seen again. But here's the part. Most people don't know there are medieval records, stone inscriptions, and stained glass windows that strongly suggest it actually happened. June 26, 1284. 130 children walked out of Hamelin. They followed a stranger through the gates, past the river, and into the mountains. They never returned. And the strangest thing, there were no rats in the earliest versions of the tale. That detail, it was added centuries later. So what really happened? Was it mass abduction, occult disease, death, or something no historian dares to admit? Because when you start peeling back the layers, this story shifts from fairy tale to historical nightmare. And no matter which theory you believe, one thing is chillingly clear: someone somewhere needed to cover up what truly happened. In this video, we're going to dig deep into the true story behind the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Not the sanitized children's book version, but the lost manuscripts, the forbidden street with no music, the ancient plea carved in stone. We'll follow every breadcrumb of real historical evidence left behind by monks, villagers, and terrified survivors. Because this isn't just some creepy bedtime story. It's one of the oldest unsolved disappearances in European history, and the more we investigate, the more sinister it becomes. Was the Piper a demon, a wanderer, a hired recruiter? Or was he just a story, a convenient scapegoat to hide something unspeakable? Stay with me, because the melody isn't over yet, and the silence in Hamelin still echoes with questions no one dares to answer. I was 5 years old when the music came, and though I couldn't hear it, I still remember the moment the world changed. The wind felt different, the air tightened, and every other child in Hamelin simply stopped what they were doing. We were a town of laughter once, tucked beneath forested hills and the bend of the Weser River. Hamelin thrived in the warm cradle of summer. Our streets bustled with merchants, bakers, fishermen. The bells rang daily from the church tower, and children played in the shadow of timber-framed houses. It was the kind of town you'd expect to find in a fairy tale. But fairy tales lie. Or worse, they tell the truth, in ways that sound too beautiful to be real. That summer, 1284, we were suffering. Not from war or famine, but something stranger: rats. Thousands of them. They spilled through our streets, over rooftops, and into pantries. They devoured our grain, climbed into cradles, and scurried across dining tables like they owned the place. No trap worked. No cat was brave enough. They gnawed through walls. They chewed through hope. People started whispering that God had cursed us, that we'd done something wrong. Then one day, as if summoned by the town's desperation, he arrived. I never saw him with my own eyes, but I saw the way others looked at him, as though something was off, something not quite human. He was tall, sharp-featured, with wild eyes and clothes that shimmered in clashing colors: scarlet, gold, emerald, indigo. He carried a flute, and when he raised it to his lips, people said the world tilted, that the notes wrapped around you like vines, that you couldn't think, you could only follow. He told the town council, "I can rid you of your rats, but I don't work for free. My price is 1,000 gold coins, a fortune." But what's money when your children sleep beside vermin? They agreed. Desperation always says yes, and so he played. The melody, they said, was like nothing ever heard. Not joyful, not sad, something between. Something that hooked behind your ribs and pulled. And then the rats came, crawling from wells, leaping from rooftops, slithering under doors. Hundreds, thousands, a black tide that followed him through the streets to the banks of the Weser River, where they plunged into the water and drowned. By sundown, Hamelin was clean. By nightfall, the town erupted in celebration. But the piper returned to the town hall, held out his hand, and asked for what he was owed. The mayor laughed. 1,000 coins for playing a song. Others mocked him, called him a trickster. Some claimed the rats were diseased and would have died anyway. They dismissed him, and worse, they dismissed the contract. He said nothing at first, just stared. Then, as if something behind his eyes broke loose, he spoke. "You'll regret this." The next few days passed in eerie calm. The rats were gone. Life returned. But something hung in the air like the scent of a storm still forming far away. Then came the morning of June 26th, the feast of Saints John and Paul. The adults were in church. The children were in the streets. And the piper returned. He stood in the center of town, bathed in morning light. And when he raised the flute to his lips this time, the melody was different. Softer, sadder, but impossible to resist. The children froze mid-play, eyes glazed, smiles vanished. And then they followed. All of them. Through the market square, down the winding alleys, past the town gates. No one stopped them. No one knew. The church bells were ringing too loudly. They climbed toward a mountain in the north, and when they reached it, a great cleft opened in the stone, and they stepped inside, and the mountain closed behind them. Only a few remained: a boy with a twisted leg, a girl who had lost her hearing at birth, a handful too sick to walk. They stood alone, trembling, with no words to explain what they'd witnessed. When the church service ended and the parents stepped out into the sun, the town was quiet. Too quiet. The laughter was gone. And then, the screams began. Mothers tore through streets. Fathers stormed through gates. They shouted names, searched rivers, dug through earth. But no child ever returned. Not a single footprint. Not a single sound. Just silence. And in that silence came the guilt. People tried to forget, but forgetting is a kind of death too. So instead, they rewrote the story. They added rats. They made the piper a villain. They made the parents victims. But I was there, and I remember what the world looked like when the children vanished. I remember the silence. And I've spent 80 years wondering, what would have happened if we had just paid him? They say the worst sound is silence. But that morning, silence became something else entirely. It wasn't just quiet. It was wrong. The church bells had stopped. The hymns had ended. And the streets of Hamelin should have been filled with children's laughter. But they weren't. The cobblestones were empty. The air hung heavy, like the town itself was holding its breath. I remember the moment the first mother screamed, and then another, and another, until the town erupted not in song but in chaos. We searched everything, every alley, every attic, every inch of forest and riverbank. People ran door to door. They dug under barns. They climbed trees, hoping, begging to see even one child wandering back barefoot and confused. But there was nothing. Not a single shoe, not a single voice. Only the ones who couldn't follow remained. We, the broken ones, the deaf, the lame, the ones too small, too sick, too slow. And we were the ones who had to describe what we saw. But who listens to a crippled child, who believes the deaf girl who couldn't hear the melody? Still I tried. I told them the piper came back, that he played again, that the children stopped like statues and walked entranced toward the mountain, that the rocks split open, swallowed them whole and sealed shut. But the townsfolk didn't want to believe, because believing meant facing the truth. This wasn't magic, it was punishment. And they caused it. The mayor ordered guards to break into the hills. They dug where we pointed. They climbed, searching for caves. But the mountain mocked them, solid stone, no crack, no trail, no hope. And then, the blaming began. Maybe the piper was a demon. Maybe it was a cult. Maybe the children ran away. But we knew the truth. We had seen it with our own eyes. And the worst part was, no one wanted to admit what they'd done. They said the piper never existed, that the children were taken by wolves, that they drowned in the Weser. They erased him, buried the story, changed the narrative, and then they added rats. Yes, the rats weren't in the original story. That part came much later, decades after the children vanished. A clever rewrite, a convenient scapegoat. Blame the vermin. Blame the pestilence. Blame anything but yourselves. The first time I heard someone mention rats, I froze, because I knew what they were doing. They weren't trying to explain the tragedy. They were trying to survive it. A new version of the story began to spread. A Pied Piper came to save Hamelin from rats. He was betrayed. He took the children as revenge. Simple, neat, palatable. But it was a lie. There were no rats. There was no plague. There was only silence and the unbearable weight of guilt. And so they did what all guilty people do. They built a legend to forget the truth. They stopped saying the children died. They said they were taken. And when that didn't work, they said they left. But no one ever said why the town never truly searched. Why no bodies were found. Why not a single adult followed them? Or why after that day music was banned on Bungenstrasse, the street where the children were last seen. No singing, no dancing, no instruments, only silence. That street still exists. Tourists walk it now, snapping photos, unaware that their footsteps echo over the final place 130 children were ever seen alive. And the inscriptions remain etched into old stone, translated across generations. In the year 1284, after the birth of Christ from Hamelin, were led away 130 children born at this place, led by a piper into a mountain. No mention of rats, no mention of music, just children and a piper. The tension didn't end that summer. It grew like rot beneath the walls. Parents moved away. Survivors grew up in silence. The church gave no answers. The council passed no decrees. But every June 26th you could feel it, the weight pressing on the stones of the town, like the mountain never fully closed. Some say the children died. Some say they were enslaved. Others say they simply kept walking and never looked back. But I wonder, what if we were meant to forget them? What if that was the price? Because I still remember the look on the piper's face when they refused to pay him. Not rage, not madness, but a calm kind of promise. And in the end, he kept it. You think this was just a fairy tale, a dark warning for greedy townsfolk wrapped in song and myth. But the more you dig, the more you realize this story wasn't written to entertain. It was written to hide. Let's talk facts. Not legends, not lullabies. In the town of Hamelin, official records dated 1384 begin with a sentence that should not exist. It is 100 years since our children left. No mention of plague, no mention of rats. Just a matter-of-fact acknowledgement that 130 children were gone. And then there's the Lüneburg manuscript dated around 1450, written by a monk. It isn't poetry. It isn't parable. It's a dry chronicle of local history, and in it, he writes of an event in 1284. A man with a pipe led 130 children out of Hamelin. They never returned. Let me repeat that a monk and official historian wrote this down, not as myth, as memory, still not enough. There was once a stained glass window in St. Nikolai Church, dated around the year 1300, just 2 decades after the disappearance. It showed a man in colorful clothing surrounded by children dressed in white. Historians described it as early as the 14th century. And while the window was destroyed in 1660, sketches of it still exist. The details too precise to ignore. Even the town's architecture refuses to forget. On the old town gate stood the inscription in the year 1284. From Hamelin were led 130 children into the mountain. And on Bungenstrasse, still called the street without music, dancing, singing, or playing instruments is still prohibited. To this day, why would a town enforce silence for over 7 centuries unless it was afraid of what sound might bring back? So we ask what actually happened, and here's where the horror multiplies. One theory says the children were sold. In medieval Europe, mass migration wasn't uncommon. Lords needed settlers for distant lands. One noble in Transylvania, yes, the same region later associated with Dracula, reportedly recruited German-speaking migrants in the late 13th century. Records show sudden surges of surnames from Hamelin appearing in new settlements. Around 1285. Could the piper have been a recruiter paid to lead a group of children, or rather young laborers, into a new colony? And when the town refused to acknowledge what they'd done, they buried it beneath folklore. But if that's true, why no return? Why no letters? No survivors, no answers? Another theory ventures deeper. In nearby Erfurt, in 1237, just 47 years earlier, chroniclers recorded a strange event. A group of children began dancing uncontrollably down the road to Arnstadt. Many died of exhaustion. Others went mad. It mirrored other outbreaks of what we now call the dancing plague, a bizarre medieval phenomenon where entire communities danced, screamed, collapsed, and died. Could the children of Hamelin have been caught in something similar? A mass hysteria? A neurological illness? But again, why only the children? Why that exact day, and why did no one follow? Still others believe in something darker. In a Latin manuscript once held by the monastery, a chilling verse was recorded, later translated in 1761. 1284 is the year when 130 dear children of Hamelin were swept away. Not without doom, Calvary swallowed them. Calvary, the place where Christ was crucified, the place of skulls, a site of execution. Could this have been a ritual sacrifice, a punishment, an excommunication of an entire generation? Is that why only the crippled, the deaf, and the mute were spared? Because they were deemed unworthy of whatever fate awaited the rest? What if the piper wasn't the villain, but the mask worn by something far older, a symbol to soften the blow, to redirect the blame, to make the unimaginable just folklore? And then there's the most terrifying idea of all. What if the piper was real, not a metaphor, not a recruiter, but something that walked through Hamelin with full intent and took exactly what he came for? Because throughout Europe, in stories scattered from Norway to France, we find variations of this figure, a wandering man in multicolored clothes, a flute that entrances, a group that follows, never to return, different towns, same melody, same ending. What if this wasn't just a story? What if it was a pattern? And if that's true, what makes you think he only came once? What happens to a town that loses all its children in a single morning and never finds out why Hamelin did not heal? It rewrote. It rewrote the memory, repainted the truth, scrubbed away the sound of the flute until it became folklore, until it could be told without shaking. And even then, it still shook. The silence wasn't just in the streets. It lived in the walls, in the pauses during conversation, in the way mothers stopped singing lullabies, in the empty chairs at dinner tables that no one dared to move. And so began the slow construction of a lie not to deceive outsiders, but to protect the broken hearts left behind. The piper became a symbol, a fable, a scapegoat with a colorful coat and a simple motive: revenge. Easier to stomach than the idea that 130 souls were erased from existence, with no one stopping them, with no one following. It's not that the story survived, it's that the guilt needed it to. Every society has a ghost story, but Hamelin didn't invent one, it lived through it. The memory became a myth because admitting the truth meant facing the unbearable. That maybe the town didn't just lose its children, it gave them away, or worse, watched them go. And still something lingered, something unspoken encoded in tradition. The ban on music in Bungenstrasse still exists. For over 700 years, no instruments are allowed on that road. Tourists walk it unaware, but the locals remember. They always remember. Why does a street fear music unless the sound itself is what opened the mountain? And then there are the festivals, the rituals, the oddly formal acknowledgement of June 26th. The way people light candles and say nothing. As if speaking aloud might summon the sound again. As if the flute still waits behind the stones. That's what grief does when it festers. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It ritualizes itself into daily life, until even forgetting becomes a sacred act. But there's something darker underneath all of it, a collective shame too heavy to hold. Because what if the piper was invited? What if he was hired? What if the town knowingly or not consented? In medieval Europe, the law of primogeniture meant only the firstborn inherited. Younger siblings, especially boys, were often pushed out, forced to find their own way. Sometimes entire groups of second sons were encouraged to migrate to settle in distant lands under noble banners. Was this really abduction, or was it exile with a flute? The town's records don't deny the event, but they never ask the right question: why didn't anyone follow? That is the core of the horror. Not just that they vanished, but that no adult went after them. No chase, no rescue, no reckoning. A mountain opened, and no one climbed in. That's not just a tragedy. That's complicity. And maybe that's why the rats were added, to create a villain, a reason, a structure. Because blaming a plague is easier than facing the mirror. Saying he took them is easier than admitting we let him, because we owed him gold and paid in blood instead, and that transaction, it still echoes. Even now, historians debate what happened. Was it mass migration, mass death, hysteria, a recruitment gone wrong, a plague of belief? But every theory only deepens the wound, because each one shifts the blame without resolving the silence. And that silence has weight. You feel it in the ancient stone markers, the translated inscriptions etched by trembling hands. You hear it in the Latin verse Calvary swallowed them. You feel it in the dead ends of every theory. The lack of bodies, the absence of survivors, the impossibility of full truth. And in that void, the piper lives, not as a man, not even as a myth, but as a question society never answered. What happens when a community chooses denial over justice? He is what fills the gap between fact and fear. And that's what makes this story timeless. Not the flute, not the children, but the fact that we still can't look directly at what happened, that we're still whispering theories instead of screaming truths. Hamelin never built a monument, never held a funeral. Because how do you bury a memory that refuses to die? You don't. You turn it into a bedtime story, and pray no one ever asks too many questions. But the street without music still stands, and the mountain still waits. And somewhere under all the rewritten verses and stained glass lies, the truth still plays its song. And maybe, if you listen closely, you can still hear the last note before the silence. Maybe the piper was never meant to be understood. Maybe that's the point. He isn't a villain, or a ghost, or a warning. He's something worse. He's the sound you hear when silence gets too loud. The story of Hamelin is not just about children disappearing. It's about a town that looked away. A town that chose comfort over truth, fable over justice, forgetting over confronting. But what's most unsettling isn't what happened in 1284. It's what didn't happen after. There were no trials, no reparations, no names etched into memorial stone, no chorus of grief, just rewritten history. A fable to keep the questions quiet. And perhaps that's the true horror here. Because what does it say about a community, about any of us, when we would rather believe in a magical piper with a flute than admit we failed to protect our own? What happens when we let the music take them and call it myth? The piper's legend lingers not because it's a good story, but because we see ourselves in it. The temptation to silence the truth, to reshape the past, to choose fiction over accountability, it's not medieval. It's human. And maybe that's why this tale endures. Not just in Germany, but in every culture that's ever lost something and refused to look directly at the loss. So now I ask you, what version of the story do you believe? Do you believe the piper was real? Do you believe the children died or walked into a new life? Do you believe the town was cursed or guilty? Or do you, like most, just want to close the book and sleep, but before you do, pause? Because somewhere out there in a forgotten forest, there may still be a mountain waiting. And beneath that mountain, maybe, there are names, voices, echoes of 130 songs never finished. Maybe we owe them more than silence. Maybe we owe them memory, curiosity, conversation. So tell me, what do you think happened in Hamelin that morning? Because this story isn't finished. It was never finished. It waits for those brave enough to ask, brave enough to dig deeper, and brave enough to speak aloud the questions that make others uncomfortable. And maybe that's you. If this story stirred something in you, something uneasy, something unresolved, don't let it end here. Leave a comment below. I want to hear your theory. No matter how wild, no matter how grounded, hit subscribe if you want more stories that peel back the fairy tales and reveal the bone beneath. And save this video. Because truth like this, it tends to get buried again. Fast. Because the piper isn't just a figure in a legend. He's a mirror. And the silence he leaves behind, that's ours to fill.